interfacial waves and doing linear modeling and numerical modeling, done experiments. So it's a real joy to have you here, and the floor is yours, Johannes.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers of this seminar for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present my PhD results to you. Actually, I started with studying boundary layer separation, so wave-induced boundary layer separation. So that's when flow that follows a topography, for example a mountain, is suddenly lifted off, forced to lift off from the surface and then rolls up into turbulent rotors or turbulent structures. And I soon recognized the importance of waves in that process, because waves force the flow to separate from the surface, or can trigger all kinds of different phenomena related to mountains. And I also realized how important interfacial Lie waves are in their context. So those are waves that develop on, for example, the boundary layer inversion, and when they have large amplitude, they can trigger those atmospheric rotors, for example. We'll come to that later anyway. Before I go into the details, I'd like to thank my colleagues and co-authors, Stefano Serafin, Professor Obavijest, and Ivana Stiberski. And yeah, I think I have to switch slides maybe. Right, yeah. So let's go to the line of my talk. I have 4 sections for you today. I will start with some general remarks on Lie waves. Then I will transition to describing how to describe the wavelength of interfacial waves. Then how to describe the amplitude of interfacial waves. So this is still preliminary research. And then at the very end, I will talk again about wave-induced boundary separation, as I introduced already to you. So let's start with some general remarks. Thanks to satellites, we can observe Lie waves almost every day. So I put 2 examples here. This is one Lie wave event that emerged from the Dalmatian coast towards Italy. So wind is coming from the northeast in that case, and the Lie wave is excited by the mountains and propagate in the southwest. And then 4 days later, on Valentine's Day, as I just realized, there is so there are 2 Lie wave trends actually. One that is, so this is a Vienna. This is the region of Vienna. Vienna would be here. And there is one Lie wave train that emerges right leeward of Vienna, so wind is coming from south. Here is one Lie wave train that is excited by Mount Kahlenberg. And there is a second Lie wave train that is excited by the Leitergebirge, which is somewhere here. And in far distance, both merge. Yeah, it's good to learn science. What is remarkable here is that the mountain which excites the Lie wave train is only about 150 meters high with respect to the ground. But still, the Lie wave travels hundreds of kilometers all the way to the Czech Republic. So even if there is a small perturbation, the Lie wave train can just go over hundreds of kilometers. And we see a similar thing here for the equation in wave case. Now this is a little bit more technical. There are 2 types of Lie waves actually. So when you look at review papers or at books, or even search the web for Lie waves, then this is the explanation that you get, which is resonant Lie waves. So those are basically, so if you have a mountain and flow, stratified flow over the mountain, then the mountain excites gravity waves that propagate vertically. And they propagate vertically up to a level above which vertical propagation is not supported anymore. So what happens is that the wave gets reflected. And the reflected wave superimposes on the upward propagating wave, causing a horizontal wave motion like we saw before. So this is one case, but there is also another possibility how Lie waves can occur. And that's the case of interfacial Lie waves. So when you think of a water surface and you throw a stone into the water, then you get waves traveling on the interface the density interface between water and air. And something similar is happening actually at the boundary layer inversion. So if a mountain perturbs the inversion, then the wave is traveling along the density interface, similar to surface water waves. Yeah. So that's the second type of Lee waves, and my talk will focus on this type of Lee waves. Then another remark I would like to make is that Lee waves are trapped waves. So that's actually an important property of those waves. So here is an example of such an interfacial Lee wave. So there is an inversion here, or a density jump if you wish, or if you want. And you see that the mountain excites a continuous spectrum of wave modes. And some of the wave modes have too long a wavelength in order to be trapped at the interface. So the wavelength is so long that they can propagate into the upper layer. So they are not trapped. And it's those waves that just propagate away. They are not trapped on the interface. But the Lee wave disturbance, or the wavelength of the Lee wave disturbance, is too short to propagate into the upper layer. So it cannot propagate above, but it stays trapped on the interface. And when you consider the case of a neutrally stratified upper layer, so there is potential, constant potential temperature, then you see that the wave is trapped. There are no wave modes propagating into the upper atmosphere, but only the Lee wave mode arises.
This is vertical velocity, right?
Yes, this is vertical velocity. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yeah. So rate would be down, up, down, up, down. Another important property is that the wavelength of Lee waves is independent of the mountain. So you can have a broad, wide mountain, and the wavelength will be just the same as for a short, tiny mountain. But the amplitude will be different. So this is somehow different to a continuously stratified wave, where the width of the mountain has an impact on the wave shape, and also on the horizontal wavelength. But here this is not the case. And another important property is that Lee waves are typically stationary. So that means that their phase speed is just opposite of the flow speed. So if flow is coming from the direction, the wave has to travel against the incoming flow at the same speed in order to stay where it is, and to stay attached to the mountain. So that's an important property. And the last remark I'd like to make is that the phase speed of interfacial waves depends on the wavelength. So long waves have typically a larger phase speed than shorter waves. And then constraining that the waves are stationary, we find that for larger wind speeds, the phase speed has to be larger, and consequently, the wavelength has to be larger. So for large wind speeds, we expect larger wavelengths, and vice versa for weak wind speeds. Okay, so let me come to the second part of my talk, which is on the wavelength. So I got more interested in how the wavelength depends on the flow parameters. And so I wanted to have a simple function for the wavelength that depends on the upstream flow parameters. And it appears that those functions exist. Those are called frequency dispersion relationships. And they relate the phase speed of the wave, as we just saw before, with their wavelength, or with their wave number, which is just 2 pi over the wavelength. Yeah, and one can derive those frequency dispersion relationships from linear theory. If you have 2 fluid layers and set the boundary conditions accordingly, and then you use the solutions to the Taylor-Boltzmann equation, you can derive those frequency dispersion relationships. And this is one of those FDRs, frequency dispersion relationships, and it belongs to a flow that is set up like this. So you have 2 neutral layers, and in between you have a potential temperature jump. or a density jump if you think of another fluid like water, for example, water and oil. And you see that this function is actually already quite simple. So it involves the upstream wind speed, the inversion strength implicitly included in the reduced gravity. Here we have the wavelength implicitly in the wave number, and we have the height of this layer. Now this equation causes us a problem. Namely, it's transcendental, and we cannot solve it for k. So this wave number is inside the cotangent, the hyperbolic cotangent, and outside, so we cannot solve it for k. So what we have to do is we have to make an assumption or approximation for this cotangent term. And the first obvious thing to do would be to do the shallow water approximation. So to assume that the lower layer is shallow. And when we do that, the equation collapses to this simple shallow water approximation form that most of you probably know. But here, the influence of the wavelength vanishes. So k cancels out. So we cannot get any information on the wavelength of that wave. And the reason is that shallow water waves are non-dispersive. So the wavelength does not play a role for the phase speed, and so we cannot determine the wavelength. But fortunately, the hyperbolic cotangent is a very friendly function and allows for a second approximation, that is the deep water approximation. If we assume that this lower layer is very deep, then we get this frequency dispersion relationship. And here k retains in the FDR, but we lose information on the layer height and layer depth. But as it will turn out later, for Lie waves, it's okay to assume that the influence of the layer height is negligible. And this is a very simple function, actually. So the wavelength depends only on the inversion strength and the wind speed. So that's very easy, actually, to calculate the wavelength for those waves. And we can do a similar thing. So that comes from Turner's book. And we can do a similar thing for the case where the upper layer is stratified, like in boundary layer flow. That comes from Roscoe 2004. And you can see that the FDR looks pretty similar to the previous case, but there is an additional term, scorer parameter here, that accounts for stratification. And if we do again the deep water approximation, then this is the expression that we get for those waves. And when we compare it to the previous case, you see that there's just an additional term that accounts for stratification. And now it would be interesting to test whether these equations are valid and if they're accurate for the atmosphere. And so we come back to the Lie wave case that we had at the very beginning. So this is Vienna, this is Mount Kahlenberg, and the wavelength that we see here is 3.9 kilometers. Interestingly, the second Lie wave train has a longer wavelength. And we will use that theory that I just presented to you to find the reason for why the wavelength, this is just 30 kilometers, so why the wavelength is so much longer over here. But for now, we will focus on this Lie wave train, and we pick the data from a radio sounding in Vienna that captures pretty well the upstream conditions for this Lie wave train. And you see that there is a neutrally stratified lower layer, then there is an inversion, so a potential temperature jump, and above the layer is continuously stratified. So it's the setup that we were looking at just before. Wind speed is approximately uniform with height. And when we look at the scorer parameter, we can find something very interesting, because you see that the scorer parameter has a spike here at the region of the inversion. And that can tell you whether the wave can vertically propagate or not. And this dashed line over here, it indicates the wave number of the Lie wave. So whenever the dashed line is to the left of this solid curve, the wave is allowed to propagate vertically. Otherwise, it's damped out. So in these regions, the wave cannot propagate. So it's trapped on the interface. So it seems to be a an interfacial lee wave. And we can now estimate the parameters from the sounding, so making an idealized sounding here. And these are pretty standard values for the atmosphere, so we can observe them pretty often. And when we insert the numbers into the two equations, we get wavelengths that are pretty close to what we observed. So those equations seem to be robust. And now I wanted to know how the wavelength of the lee wave depends on the upstream flow parameters. This is a very busy slide. However, it illustrates those influences quite well, I think. So there are two curves that I'm showing here. We are solving the full frequency dispersion relationships without any approximation. We have to solve them numerically, but that can be done easily. And we consider the case with a neutral upper layer and the case with a stratified upper layer. And those four panels show the influence of the inversion strength in terms of potential temperature jump, then of the layer height, of the stratification above the inversion, and of horizontal wind speed. And you can immediately see that the wavelength decreases with increasing inversion strength. So that's also somehow intuitive. But something more interesting occurs for the influence of the lower layer height, because at a certain depth, or above a certain depth, the influence of the layer height on the solution is just negligible. And that's exactly the case when the deep water approximation becomes valid. So in our case, we're just here at the edge, so we can say the influence of the layer height is negligible, and we can use the deep water approximation for predavaonici. In terms of the stratification, we see that increasing stratification above the inversion decreases the wavelength. And for wind speed, so with increasing wind speed, the wavelength increases as well. So this is consistent with the point that I was making at the beginning, that for larger flow speeds, we expect longer wavelengths. And now we can try to have a look at why the second lee wave trend has a longer wavelength. So when we take these 6.3 kilometers and we go back to this diagram and say 6.3, that's pretty much up here in terms of the, so we can say that, I don't know, the inversion strength is just much weaker there. So we can say, or search for an inversion strength that would cause these 6.3 kilometers. That would be somewhere here at 3, a little bit more than 3 Kelvin. But a difference of almost 7 Kelvin inversion strength within 20 kilometers. So changing inversion strength of 7 Kelvin within 20 kilometers is unrealistic for the atmosphere. So in terms of layer height, we would need a almost 500, a little bit less, 400 meters shallow layer. And that's also unrealistic that the boundary layer decreases so fast within 20 kilometers. Stratification does not manage to get 6 kilometers at all, because it ends here at 3.6 or so kilometers. So it has to be the wind speed that for 6 kilometers wavelength we need about 13 meters per second. And in fact, when you look at the forecasts, you see that within those 20 kilometers, wind speed increased of about that size. So we are pretty close. Okay, and that brings me to my second part of the presentation, which is now the amplitude. So this is still preliminary results, but I'd like to give you a sneak preview of what we're doing right now. So the amplitude is actually the more important parameter of a lee wave. So if the amplitude is large, then, for example, the flow can separate at the surface. As is illustrated here, it's very hard to see probably, even for me from that distance. But you can believe me that those regions are white, and white corresponds to negative wind speeds. So there are flow reversals at the surface. Or in other words, the forcing of the waves from above, the pressure forcing, is so strong that it reverts the flow direction at the surface. We'll come to that later again, so that becomes a little bit clearer. But
So this is horizontal or vertical wind? This is vertical wind.
No, this is horizontal wind. Horizontal wind. And when that happens, then you get those flow reversals. Those are very turbulent regions, and that's hazardous for aviation, for example. So that's why it's important to look at the amplitude. And we wanted to have, again, a simple function for the amplitude based on the upstream flow parameters. And you can see already from the dots that it's not that easy. So the problem is that if you use linear theory again, that linear theory dramatically overestimates the wave amplitudes. And that's what I will show you on the next few slides. And I will use water tank experiments for that. So we went to Toulouse in France, and there is a large 20-meter long water tank, like an aquarium. And we filled that water tank with water, according to a certain density profile by changing salinity of the water. So it's again a profile that is similar to an idealized boundary layer flow with convective boundary layer flow, with neutral stratification below. Then again, in that case, it's a density jump, and above it's stratified flow. And at the bottom, we tow a mountain that is about 13 centimeters high through the tank, and what we see are lee waves in the lee. So instead of putting fishes into the aquarium, we put little particles that of different size that distribute in the flow in order to visualize the movement of the interface. And then we can measure the amplitudes here and the wavelength and try to use different theories to test whether they work for those types of flows. And our first approach was to use linear theory. And as you can see, the wave amplitude, so this is a linear solution, linear flow solution for the very same setup as you see below here. And you see that the amplitudes are dramatically overestimated. And when you look at the mountain, you see that the linear model does not capture the flow over the mountain right. So that's a basic problem that linear theory has with those large amplitude lee waves, or with interfacial lee waves, that actually the hydraulics of flow over the mountain are so important, and those hydraulics involve nonlinear processes, and the linear model cannot capture that. So we cannot use it actually to determine the wave amplitude. So we need a different approach, and we thought that it would be actually very nice to combine a hydraulic model with a linear model. So modeling the hydraulics of the flow over the mountain with the hydraulic model, and then using a linear model with the information that we get from the hydraulic model to estimate the wave amplitude. And we looked at the literature, and it turned out that this has been done already in the past. So it actually goes back 100 years almost, back to Lord Rayleigh, who used hydraulic theory to determine the energy that is lost at the jump. So in essence, what we're doing is we develop a two-component model. We have an energy source component, which is based on hydraulic theory, and we have a linear wave component. And now I'd like to focus on the energy source component. So when you think of a single layer flow over a mountain, then you get a transition of the flow from subcritical to supercritical, so you get very fast wind speeds here. And then at a certain distance downstream of the mountain, the flow has to readjust back to its previous state, to its previous height. And at the location where it readjusts back, Rayleigh showed that energy is lost. And typically what we think of happens with that energy is dissipation. So in a hydraulic jump, we think that everything mixes at the jump, and then it becomes subcritical again. But actually, Fabre found that if the jump is not too large but weaker, instead of dissipation or dissipating this energy, or instead of the conversion to turbulent kinetic energy in dissipation, this energy actually is transferred into wave energy. So instead of dissipation here, smooth waves develop and radiate this energy away. And the one, I hope I pronounced it right, I'm not very good in French, actually not at all. He was the first one who took this two-component approach and matched or merged hydraulic theory with linear theory. And however, that exists only for a single layer fluid, and we wanted to extend it for a two-layer fluid, like the atmosphere. And that's what we did. And we are using this model for estimating the energy loss at an internal jump. So this is a channel with two rigid boundaries, and we can estimate the energy loss using this equation. So the rate of energy accumulation at the jump, and so this delta EF can either dissipate in hydraulic jump or radiate through leadways. And this is our linear model, and we can derive an equation for the amplitude of the wave and the wave energy flux. So it's a relation of those two parameters. And if we now use this delta EF that I just mentioned before, this one, and plug it as it is into the wave energy flux, then we get an amplitude estimation. And we did it for the water tank experiments. Oh, I see that there are two magical symbols. Here, that should be greater equal. So we can have certification in both layers. And when we estimate the amplitudes from theory and compare it with the measurements in the water tank, then this is what we get. So it's actually not too bad. So those are the water tank experiments, and those are the theoretical estimations using this two-component approach. And it appears that, so we see that there's a little bit of scatter, but the theory is doing a good job. When you think of linear theory, using only linear theory, those points would be somewhere at the roof of the building. So I tried that, it does not make sense. So this is a dramatic improvement compared to linear theory, and we're still studying of what that means and how far we can go and so on. So that's preliminary research still. And now I'd like to come to the last section of my talk, which is on wave-induced boundary layer separation. Now I'm using a little bit, or I'm using a different setup than before. So I'm considering only continuously stratified flows. So the simplest setup that you can think of, continuous stratification with a certain value of n, uniform wind speed, and a mountain. But before I go into the details, I'd like to tell you a little bit more in detail what wave-induced boundary layer separation is. And therefore, I'm using this figure. It comes from Golan to Venn, and it's probably hard to see from the back. There is some wave motion here. This comes from the gravity wave, and this wave imposes a pressure gradient at the surface. And the pressure gradient goes from high pressure to low pressure, so it acts in that direction, and it decelerates the incoming flow. And if the pressure gradient is strong enough, so if the amplitude is large enough, then the flow is decelerated to rest. And as a consequence of continuity, it has to detach from the surface and rolls up into these turbulent structures here that are dangerous for aviation, as I just mentioned. And we were interested in the size and in the strength of those rotors, atmospheric rotors. So those are those vortices, turbulent vortices. And therefore, we carried out a few simulations. So those are 30 simulations. They're all 2D, and they are no slip. So they have bottom boundary, friction at the bottom boundary, so that it's easier for the wave to decelerate the flow. And we are changing two parameters here. First, you can see that we change the mountain width on the vertical axis. So this is the vertical aspect ratio. Sorry. And as I mentioned before, the width of the mountain impacts the waveform in continuously stratified flows. So it impacts the horizontal wavelength, in contrast to those interfacial waves that I just showed before. So you see here that the horizontal wavelength is much different than above. And the second parameter that we're changing is stratification on the x-axis. So you see the stratification impacts this vertical foot number, kind of nonlinear parameter, nonlinearity parameter. So if this is greater than 1 or about 1, then the waves tend to overturn and break. And that's what we see here. So this is weak stratification, and stratification increases, and at a certain point we get wave breaking, and get downslip windstorms in the lee of the mountain. And what you can also see here, and that's what we are interested in, are those little tiny wiggles at the bottom boundary that indicate reversed flow. So they are blue. I have a little zoom in so that it's easy to see. So in the lee of the mountain, the flow detaches and those rotors form. And we were interested in how much the mountain size and the stratification impact the size and the strength of those rotors. And so we measured them in the simulations. So we measured the rotor strength as the strongest reversed flow, and the rotor height as the height of this neutral turbulent layer. So since the rotors are turbulent, they're well mixed, and they have neutral stratification in here, and above they're a little bit strong stratified, and you can detect it from the potential temperature profile. So we can determine those two parameters for all the simulations. So in each simulation you get two values, and we compress them, combine them in a small diagram, and it looks like this. So these are the simulation results, and you see that the rotors are highest in the upper right corner of the diagram. So those are non-hydrostatic and non-linear flows. And then we thought it would be nice to get some theory to see whether we can explain that behavior with internal gravity wave theory. And so we thought of two proxies that relate to rotor height and strength. So a linear model cannot model a rotor because a rotor is a very nonlinear phenomenon. But a linear model can very well model the wave properties. So the vertical wind speed in the updraft of the wave and the pressure gradient force at the surface. And those are the two parameters that we use. So it's intuitive to think that if there is a large updraft in the wave, that the rotors might be higher or have a larger vertical extent. And if the pressure gradient force acts very strongly on the flow, then it decelerates very much and the reversed flow is stronger. And when we compute those parameters in the same parameter space, then we see that it's again the same corner that is pronounced in this distribution. So when we compare it with the previous diagram, this looks actually not too bad. And this tells us that linear theory, or internal gravity wave theory, can explain to a certain extent the strength and the height of rotors, or why they are particularly strong or particularly large in vertical extent. And when we put that into scatter diagrams, so here are non-hydrostatic flows and hydrostatic flows and something in between, then we see, so this is the theoretical, this is the proxy from internal gravity wave theory, and this is the rotor height, this is pressure, gradient force, and rotor strength. So theory, simulation, simulation. Then we see that for the non-hydrostatic cases, the theoretical proxies can explain very well the rotor height behavior and also the rotor strength. But for the hydrostatic cases, they are clustered here and here. This is not the case. And we were seeking for a long time for the reason why this is the case. And it turned out, well, okay, this is what I just explained. Sorry, I will come to that in a minute. So these are the non-hydrostatic cases where the updrafting wave is very large and the rotors are correspondingly high. And in the hydrostatic cases, there is something else developing here that is not related to the mountain wave aloft. So the updrafts in this wave are not very large, you see, compared to the non-hydrostatic cases. But still there is the disturbance that has very large perturbations. And it turned out that it's again an interfacial wave that develops. So it's kind of a secondary wave development in the lee of the mountain. So the shooting flow that goes down here is strongly stratified and then detaches from the surface and then oscillates and triggers one rotor after the other. And when you cut the profile over here, you will see that the upper layer is almost neutrally stratified. Then you have strong stratification, and you have a neutrally stratified lower layer. And it turns out that using the wavelength frequency dispersion relationship for those waves, can give a very good estimation for the wavelength of this rotor disturbance. We have not looked at the amplitude yet. That would be on the list for future ongoing research. So to sum it up, in the non-hydrostatic cases, it's internal gravity wave theory that can explain the properties of the rotor. And in the hydrostatic cases, it's again interfacial wave theory that can explain the size of the rotors. And that brings me to my summary. Yeah, so the wavelength is independent of the mountain, and we can calculate it with a very simple function based on the upstream flow profile. Then, in terms of the amplitude, we found that linear theory alone is not reliable to predict the amplitude of a wave, and found that a combination of hyperbolic theory with linear theory works actually quite well. And in terms of wave-induced boundary layer separation, I just mentioned that in non-hydrostatic flows it's internal gravity wave theory, and in hydrostatic flows it's interfacial wave theory that can explain the rotor properties. And there are two references to literature where you can read more about those things. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and for listening.
Before I open the floor for questions and discussion, I'd like to say that afterwards we will have a coffee, refreshment, snacks, and water afterwards here in the hall. So now we can go for the next 5 or 10 minutes. So please go ahead with questions.
Which model did you use for simulations?
I think I forgot to mention this. We used the CM1 model. It's an LES model that has been developed by George Bryant Ankar. And it was actually developed for cloud studies in hurricanes. But it turned out that it's very well suited also for topographic flows. And it has a very easy to read code, and it's easy to adapt the model compared to other models. That's also a good thing. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. You made 2D simulations, and if you, for example, have 3D simulations, do you expect the same maybe relationship with when you talked about the strength, rotor strength, and I don't know, the other parameter?
So you here?
No, I think it's height after.
It's okay.
Height strength, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you expect the same relationship?
Yeah, that's actually a good point that you're making. So turbulent flows are not realistic in 2D simulations. But well, it's probably better to go back. It's hard to see the effect have been large out. I do have that. 1 second. In 2D flows, this is rather So you see a few confined vortices in 2D because the flow cannot break up in the third dimension and do all crazy things. Just because it's constrained to be 2D. So like a infinitely long sausage in a way. Yeah, something like this. In 3D, I expect that we would get similar results because the kinetic energy that you see here in the flow is then just not confined to kinetic energy with having a large reversed flow, but breaks up into turbulent kinetic energy. And that's also what we see in 3D simulations. We did some comparison, and we saw that the reversed flow is much less, or almost vanishing, but it's a very turbulent rotor. So in terms of rotor height, you get the same results, basically, because that's the wave forcing from loft, which is laminar, and it's very well represented in 2D when you think of an infinitely long mountain ridge. But the rotor dynamics are different. And in that case, I did not do the a quantitative comparison, but I expect that the kinetic energy in the rotor would translate into turbulent kinetic energy, because turbulent values are very small here.
Okay.
So they are laminar rotors.
Okay, and the second question, I'm wondering about your deep water approximation, which you use, because you are using a limit value of 1,000 meters. And I'm just wondering when, for example, you have a PBL which is higher than 1,000 meters, and you mentioned that the top of the PBL actually is crucial for the formation of the tracked waves. So if you have, for example, PBL which is, I don't know, 2,000 meters, so actually, according to your results, how can you comment maybe
For
this fact?
2,000 meters would be even on the safer side, because of the deep water approximation, we assume that the layer is infinitely deep. It's a problem when you assume that the layer is very shallow, because then the deep water approximation is probably not valid anymore. Does that answer somehow your question?
I don't know. I don't have an answer. I just have questions.
So the deep water approximation seems that the layer is actually deep. So the deeper the inversion is, the higher the inversion is, the better for the approximation. The more accurate the approximation is. It depends also on the wavelength. So like with shallow water waves, you assume that the wavelength is infinitely long, and here you assume that it's short compared to the depth. Okay. We can maybe talk.
You can carry on with coffee and water later on.
So I saw you had 30 different simulations where you have a mounting bit and the certification of the wood. So I'm wondering, could you test this in your water tank?
Yes, and that has been done by Baines in the 80s, I think, Baines and Hoenka. And they looked 85, yeah. And they looked at boundary layer separation, and they produced a diagram. Unfortunately, I don't have it here, not on the slide, but it's over here. So it's the same thing. They had N HW and H over L, so it's the same brownish space. And they found different transition regions. So something like this, and this, and here, in the non-linear and wide mountain, in the linear region, basically there was no separation. Then up here there was separation directly in the lee of the mountain. So if you think of a very steep mountain, then the flow just rolls over. So that's called not-flow separation. Not-flow separation. And here, this is the wave-induced boundary layer separation regime. And we try to, our parameter space covers basically this region. And we found very good agreement with what we saw in these simulations with their water tank experiments.
What is the minimum horizontal speed to produce multiple waves?
That depends on the upstream flow profile. So
When we go.
you mean internal gravity waves, or you mean Lee waves on the
Yes, Lee waves.
Yeah. You basically can have them when you have very big wind speeds, then the wavelength will be very small.
Yes.
So that's what you see on the high pressure influence, where it's very low wind speeds, but still you sometimes see some boundary layer waves. That's what you see in wintertime typically. Yeah, one important point is that the wave mode needs to be trapped in the upper layer. So there is a constraint on the wavelength. You need to have a certain wavelength that is smaller than a certain critical value in order to trap the wave. And that wavelength depends on the flow parameters. So in this example, we have 10 meters per second wind. And if the inversion strength would be, for example, 2 Kelvin, then we're in this gray region where the wave is not trapped anymore because the wavelength would be too long. So that's a constraint. And you can test using this criterion whether you see an interfacial wave or it's something else.
Is there a critical surface roughness that you need to have to trigger rotors? I assume that most of the models don't give you rotors if 0 knot or if surface roughness is exactly 0 and that you have like totally free slip lower boundary condition.
I think you can get rotors even if you have free slip boundary conditions.
So there is no critical 0 knot.
I don't think so, because if the wave forcing is strong enough, I mean, theoretically, you only need a pressure gradient force. And if that pressure gradient force is strong enough to detach the flow, then this is sufficient for boundary separation or flow separation in that case, because you have no boundary for some reason. Yeah.
More questions or comments? If not, then the department will invite you all for coffee, and juice, snacks. And let's thank once again to Johannes.
Ten drop.